Oh, okay. Thank you all for staying with us. We've just talked about the human side of encryption, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the technical side of encryption, and that will be a good chance to get into some of the questions which we really only got to graze upon after the last panel. It's an interesting time to talk about encryption because earlier this month, Attorney General Barr gave a summit on the need for tech companies to provide mechanisms for law enforcement to access encrypted data. It would have been an interesting time to talk about this 2 years ago when Rod Rosenstein gave a series of testimonies saying that it was time then for tech companies to develop ways so that law enforcement could access encrypted information. It would have been an interesting time to talk about this during the Obama administration when Jim Comey gave a bunch of testimonies that it was time for tech companies to come up with ways for law enforcement agencies to be able to access encrypted information. And in fact, it would have been interesting to talk about this 25 years ago when the Clinton administration said that it was time for cell phone companies to come up with ways for law enforcement to be able to access encrypted information. A lot of the time when people talk about the encryption debate, it's presented as something that would be simple for tech companies to solve. And I think we're going to be able to get into some of the reasons why for 25 years, thousands of researchers across the world have been unable to solve this problem that is presented as being pretty simple. So to get into that, we have a great panel, and I'd like to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. So I guess starting to my right, Sharon.
Hi, is this on? Yes. I'm Sharon Bradford Franklin. I'm Policy Director at New America's Open Technology Institute. We are a civil society organization based here in Washington, D.C. We are sort of a think tank and advocacy organization, and we work on a variety of issues about providing equitable access to an internet that is open and secure. And among those issues, front and center for many years has been protecting strong encryption. You heard on the prior panel about some of the reasons why that is so important, and we'll obviously continue that conversation now.
My name is Jeff Ratner. I'm head of global cyber policy at Apple.
I'm Steve Bellovin. I'm a computer science professor at Columbia University, also affiliate faculty at Columbia Law School. I've been doing security and cryptography for more than 30 years. I've been involved in the so-called exceptional access to encryption for 25 years. So I've been doing this for quite a long time.
Okay, we have people here from a lot of different backgrounds, so I think it might be useful to start off by defining some of the terms that get thrown around a lot, but never seem to be given much more than a surface level of understanding. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about exceptional access in a bit, but before we get there, Steve, could you just explain what encryption is?
Yeah, so encryption is basically a way to scramble information so that it can't be read. It's at least 2,500 years old. Some historians will tell you it's 4,000 years old. Encryption today consists of an algorithm, a computer program, and a key. And the key is really a very long number. Sufficiently many possible keys that you can't guess them. And everybody can know the design of the algorithm. It's a design principle that's been known for close to 150 years, that your system should be secure if the algorithm is known. But you have to protect the keys. And when you encrypt something to somebody else, you both share a key. It's a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot more details that I'm not going to go into today unless appropriate. But designing encryption is really a branch of applied mathematics. For all the stuff that I've done in cryptography, I'm not capable of doing the very basic most mathematical parts. But the other thing to remember about encryption is that's always part of a system. It's not just this mathematical algorithm. It's the computer program that can implement it. It's the way that it's used. And it's the way that the keys are handled and protected. And all of these things can and often do have problems. We'll come back to those later. But basically, it's a mathematical algorithm or a computer program and a very long number that has to be kept secret, the key.
And could you quickly just explain what data at rest and data in transit are?
So there are approximately two different ways that we use cryptography today. One is data in rest. If you're going to have a conversation with somebody, you're going to send them a message, the two parties will agree on the key, using other keys, they'll agree on the key to use and encrypt that message, and that's data in motion, data in transit. The other way we use encryption is to protect our devices, the storage on our devices, our phones, our laptops, our tablets, and that's data at rest. And you're not communicating with anybody, but when you type in your PIN to open your phone, you're basically giving it the key which can be used to decrypt the data on the phone. You don't have to go agree with anybody else on it, but you have to go supply the key to the device. And when it comes to the exceptional access, there tends to be very different technical problems.
And finally, what is end-to-end encryption versus...
So end-to-end encryption, again, when you talk about cryptography, the question is who has the keys. End-to-end means that the sender encrypts it with a key, and only the ultimate recipient has the key to decrypt it. So when I send, say, a Twitter direct message, the message, message to one other person, that message is encrypted from my phone to Twitter. Twitter has the key and decrypts it. It's sitting in the clear on Twitter's computers. Then they re-encrypt it for transit, data in motion, to get to the recipient. End-to-end encryption, for example, Apple's so-called iMessage protocol, if you send a text message from one iPhone to another, it uses, or if you use a program called Signal, only the sender and the ultimate recipient have the key. Apple cannot read your messages. They don't have the key. It's sitting on the recipient's phone. So that's end-to-end, the two endpoints, the two communicants, the only ones who can read the message.
Encryption is very, very good at solving the problem that encryption can solve. It is not very good at solving the problems it can't solve. In fact, I guess nothing is good at solving the problems that they can't solve. This is why I have a panel of smart people to back me up. Sharon, could you go into some of the I guess the use cases for encryption and what it can and can't solve?
We certainly heard a lot about the use cases for encryption on the prior panel, and hopefully most of you were here for that conversation, and protecting conversations in so many settings, particularly to particularly vulnerable populations and journalists, protecting sources and so forth. And that's a lot of those conversations about the in-transit that Steve was describing, where people are trying to have their communications be secure, presumably with end-to-end encrypted messaging services. But encryption, the encryption at rest, a use case for that is protecting against hackers. When your data is being stored, wherever it is being stored, your messages, all sorts of data, encryption plays a very significant role there, protecting our financial information and all sorts of data that we want protected. You want to know what it can't do?
Yeah, I guess what it can't do in terms, on the last panel, one of the things that came up was things like privacy regulations, things that require outside help.
Yeah, if I can unpack that a little bit, and then getting to this the question that the woman in the front row asked here, there's a distinction between the rules, what power encryption has to safeguard your data, and then the rules for who can access it and when. So if we're talking, for example, about end-to-end encrypted messages, and as Steve described, only the sender and receiver have the keys, only they can see it. If it's iMessage, then Apple, I'm pointing at Jeff for Apple, Apple can't see that. So then when you have the case of Apple versus FBI, and the FBI comes and says, give us access to I'm using message now because that was actually data at rest on the phone phone was locked. But regardless, if the data is protected by encryption and Apple can't see it, then Apple can't turn it over regardless of whether the government has met the Fourth Amendment standards that would enable it to access it. There is no provision in current U.S. law that can require a tech company who doesn't have access to the encrypted messages to go and get to provide unencrypted messages to law enforcement. And the context you raised is with private services and sharing your information and third-party sharing. So there is a distinction between what Facebook or whatever social media platform has access to. If they have access to your information and they say you have signed consent to have that shared with other parties, they may send it to that other third party on encrypted channels to protect it against hackers, but that you have agreed to the permissions of who can access it, if that makes sense. So it's a difference between the permissions of who can access it, the government, whatever standards they meet, the third party, and then the encryption for how it's protected as it's in transit, or whether it's totally locked out from that company so they can't give it to anybody because they can't access it themselves.
We'll try to get into a question and answer at the end, and if not, I think everyone will stick around for a second to handle it. Hopefully we'll be able to stick to most of the encryption aspect on the panel, and then maybe talk about some of the other concerns as in private or afterwards. But in terms of what encryption is good at protecting, in terms of preventing hackers from reading data after they've breached a network, does anyone on the panel know of a better tool?
Okay, so computer security is, as I'm constantly telling my students, computer security is a systems problem. And one of my mantras in this business is you don't go through strong security, you go around it. You know, if really strong lock on the door, maybe I can just go kick the door down or remove the pin from the hinges. That's not nearly as strong. We have a lot of different moving parts that are involved in protecting our data. Encryption, when it's working correctly, happens to be the strongest one because certain parts of it, we have some pretty good mathematical guarantees. The weakest part of it's probably the software. Software, as we all know, is buggy. Anytime you've gotten a blue screen of death, anytime you've gotten a spinning beach ball, that's had to reload a web page because it didn't appear and you suddenly reload it and it does appear. That's buggy software. We all see this. You know, every month Microsoft releases patches for very, very serious vulnerabilities, and they take software security more seriously than just about anybody. The software is buggy, it's a very weak point. Human interaction is a weak point. People get tricked into disclosing their bank passwords to phishing attacks and so on. Cryptography happens to be strong, but it's a very fragile technology. It's very easy to get it wrong.
I'm not sure how many people here saw the encryption summit earlier this month, the one that was put on by Attorney General Barr. One of the points that they made was that companies that did have end-to-end encryption, like Apple, were not doing their part in helping the FBI, whereas companies like Facebook, which do not by default use end-to-end encryption, were doing most of the work. Jeff, just how little help do you give the police?
No, thanks. That's a good question. And I think there's really been this misunderstanding dating back to San Bernardino that in that case, obviously, there was a device that was encrypted at rest. And I think the perception was that Apple just doesn't help law enforcement, that we make it our job to keep them out. And that's really, I think, been an unfortunate part of the debate because that's just not true. I think, we obviously feel our responsibility is to the customer to provide them with products that are secure, that preserve their privacy. But we also understand that, part of that includes working with law enforcement. And so we actually put quite a lot of resources into that. We have a staff that's on call 24/7 that responds to law enforcement requests around the clock and also very quickly. I think I think we've disclosed that in most cases we respond to emergency requests within, I think, 20 minutes. And that's not providing the full panoply of data, but that's actually getting a live person on the phone saying, what's the problem? How can we help? Last year, we responded to over 16,000 requests for information from just U.S. law enforcement. And all this stuff is we post on our website. But if you actually track the responsiveness from year to year, it's maintained a fairly steady rate. And we actually respond to law enforcement requests, including for content data, about 80% of the time. And so I think part of the problem is that the debate really has polarized, and I think there isn't a kind of a thorough understanding of actually how tech companies, and Apple in particular, work with law enforcement and work fairly well.
Sorry. So let's get into why it's important not to break something that's fragile but effective. The point that Barr makes a lot of the time is that people on this side of the panel would refer to the extraordinary access as a debate for backdoors, whereas what he wants is a front door. He wants companies to have special keys, which they're holding and not the FBI, that they can use to enter locked devices or messages in transit. That's usually called golden key. The company would then have the golden key. It's also called key escrow. Why does that distinction not make a huge difference?
So actually, Barr and Comey have referred to front doors or golden keys. People on my side will call it back doors. The neutral term is exceptional access, which appears in National Academy Studies reports. You use the word, talk about protecting data from hackers. Here in Washington, I prefer to think of it as protecting data from spies in foreign governments and other governments. And, said encryption is the strongest defense we have, certainly for stuff that's for data in transit. I want to be able to protect this data against sophisticated adversaries. Think of an American business traveler or American government official traveling to certain countries where you don't know what's going to happen at the border, you don't know what's going to happen in your hotel room. The encryption is protecting this too. I will readily concede Attorney General Barr's and former FBI Director Comey's claim that this does hinder the FBI in solving certain crimes, although there are other techniques that they can and have used. But it's also preventing other and arguably more serious crimes. Theft of vital secret data. We're in Washington where probably one of the highest densities of foreign intelligence agents in the world.
If I can add on to that. So, first of all, with this push coming continually, as you outlined at the beginning of the panel, from DOJ and the FBI here in the U.S., they haven't actually ever provided solid statistics on this to be candid about the scope of the problem. About a year and a half ago, it actually was disclosed, the FBI admitted that the figure they had been using for some period of time before that, they've been saying over the prior year, there were 7,800 locked phones that they could not unlock because of encryption, and this was interfering with at least 7,800 cases in the prior year. And then it came out in the spring of 2018, oh, whoops, we miscounted. Figure's probably closer to 1,000. We're not sure. We'll get back to you on that. And so now all those speeches where they decided that have an asterisk, And a year and a half later, we still don't have a candid figure from them on what is the actual scope of the problem. How many cases are we actually talking about? And then the second point is with so-called exceptional access. Steve said it's the neutral term, but that's based on the notion that it can be exceptional, that we can create a mechanism where just law enforcement and just maybe US law enforcement or countries that we trust and are our allies would be able to use it. But once you create a mechanism, there is simply no way to guarantee that it won't get out there. Other countries demanding access to it, our adversaries, hackers, and so forth. It will weaken cybersecurity for all. And if I can just very quickly, one final footnote to that, Chris on the prior panel alluded to a recent article that came out by Jim Baker, and I want to call that to all of your attention. Jim Baker was the general counsel at the FBI for a period of time that included litigating the Apple versus FBI case. He worked very closely with Jim Comey. He was a very strong proponent and for the legal theory on why they should be able to demand law enforcement access. Apple had to somehow provide access to unencrypted data for them. And he has a fairly lengthy and very, very thoughtful piece that just came out this week on Lawfare. I commend it to all of you, where he has totally changed his mind on that. And basically he says, I've been thinking about the cybersecurity risks, and they are profound. And he goes through a lot of them, including China. And he says, ultimately, a solution that focuses solely on law enforcement's concerns will have profound negative implications for the nation across many dimensions. And so recognizing, yes, maybe it will help law enforcement solve certain key unknown number of cases, but the downside risk and the harm that it causes to cybersecurity in so many elements is so much greater that this is not something that makes sense.
So let's get into some of the reasons why there is still risk when we talk about something like Golden Key. I think that it's presented a lot of the time as if companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, holding the keys solves all of the security problems with having keys. I think that it's worth noting that within the past 3 years or so, very sensitive NSA data has been leaked to the internet. The NSA being one of, if not probably the securest networks, secure systems in the world. Apple has had source code leaks online. A few years back, Google was breached. There was a man in the middle. China, the attack has been attributed to China, was able to monitor messages that were not end-to-end encrypted, that were in the as they passed through Google's servers. Is there any reason to assume that when you talk about sophisticated actors, that sophisticated actors can't breach corporate networks, that they can't breach even big tech's networks?
I'm quite certain that they can. You mentioned the NSA leaks and so on. The NSA employees go through a very thorough, painstaking background check. Interviews, check your financial records, fill out this amazingly complicated form, and they still have had leaks of information. The tech companies are hiring people from all over the world because of their technical skills, without this kind of background check. What are the odds that no one working for Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, whomever, is in pay of their own home country's intelligence service? I think the odds are nil on that. But quite apart from that, again, this is all embedded in a system. When you get a decryption request, how do you know it is really from a law enforcement agent? People have gotten out of jail by sending forged faxes claiming to be a court order ordering their release. It sounds clumsy, it sounds stupid, it has worked on a number of occasions. If you just go online to your favorite search engine and ask for this, you will find cases like this. How do you know that the police officer, maybe it's assuming it's a genuine police officer, how do you know that they have a valid warrant? Something came out about 20, 25 years ago that almost every wiretap done in Tennessee was illegal because under the Tennessee Constitution, only the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation could do wiretaps, not district attorneys. And no one had noticed this for years. The whole point is that apart from the technical risks, there are all the people and procedural risks that have to be there. This is all part of the system.
Jeff, I guess, you would be exactly the person to address this. Would Apple be comfortable holding a key to all of its users' cell phones?
So I think, obviously, very publicly, we have said we don't want that to happen. And let me just step back for a little bit to kind of explain the broader context about how we look at data. It's a fundamental belief at Apple that the data that a customer uses on their device should be theirs. So we challenge ourselves to keep as little as possible and to minimize the data that we have access to. We don't monetize data. We don't build large profiles on people and then to sell that. We provide products and services. And so if you approach it with that mindset, it also is beneficial to security, right? Because if we don't trust ourselves with data and we try to limit that access, it also limits rogue employees, it limits breaches of our systems from impacting your data. And I think that's a huge value in end-to-end encryption. If we don't have the keys, no one can take it from us.
One of my mantras, something that doesn't exist can't be stolen.
That's exactly right. And actually, that's an interesting point because the way that we actually encrypt devices, that there is no key. The key doesn't exist. The key is formed once a user enters their unique passcode and it tangles with an actual unique identifier that's hard-coded into the device that we don't know. And then the key is formed. So essentially what we would, to kind of implement this master key idea that I think the Department of Justice has put forward is we would have to go from no keys being stored anywhere to a repository of master keys or individual keys being stored somewhere. And so clearly, from our perspective, that has risks.
You are I think it's safe to say, a fairly large company. Many companies are less large. What are some, if we were to implement a golden key approach, what would that do to smaller companies? How would they be able to adapt? And is it asymmetric, I guess?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I think for the companies that have invested a lot of money in security over the years, and all the large companies do, obviously trying to figure out unique solutions to problems is something that we've been pretty good at, although there is obviously the basic concept of hard math, which you can't surmount. But then you go and you look at the slew of app developers, of smaller companies. I don't think it's fair to expect these companies to be able to maintain a persistent access point and also keep it secure on top of all the other security requirements that they should have in place. So I think yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the things I think we've been pushing is that we have to make security has to be easy. Effective security is easy to use, and that's why a lot of security features are operated by default. And really that's I think a critical piece here and that's why companies have moved towards securing their devices or their networks by default.
Yeah, let me add something to that. The odds are very close to zero that an average random app developer at a small company will get this stuff right. I saw a study about 2-3 years ago. 85% of mobile apps did their cryptography incorrectly. This was simple, straightforward, off-the-shelf cryptography using well-designed, standardized libraries, and they still got it wrong. A few years before that, there were a couple of papers showing that even mobile apps from some large, sophisticated financial institutions got the cryptography wrong, forgetting essential checks against impersonation, for example. This stuff is hard to get right. Average app developers are much more focused, and rightly so, on delivering a really good experience with their apps. Security, cryptography, secure operations, these are specialized disciplines. Small companies don't have the resources to bring in such people who can do it well. They said they're not even getting the basic cryptography right. They won't get anything right against a sophisticated adversary.
And if I can just add on to the initial premise for this thread of your questions was, we have all sorts of bugs and vulnerabilities and problems with so many of these tools as it is that are unintentional. Companies are working hard to fix them, pushing out patches when they can. But so we really don't want our government to mandate building in an intentional vulnerability in every product and service. We have enough problems trying to get rid of the unintentional ones. So a requirement to build in an intentional vulnerability just really sets the cybersecurity standards way back.
One of the interesting things about the recent move from that bar summit was, for years and years, the reason that was given that that it was important to have exceptional access was that terrorists were using devices, that cell phone data at rest was critical to these investigations, that they held all of these cell phones that needed to be broken into. At that at that summit, they shifted the argument to the dangers of child exploitation, that child predators were using Facebook in order to transfer illicit material and groom potential victims. I don't want to get into a hierarchy of evil. I think everyone accepts that both of those things are bad. But the technical question changes, and I think this is something that Steve brought up at the beginning of this panel. What are the different technical challenges for data at rest and data in motion, and why is it now harder to answer the FBI's call if they want data in motion as opposed to data at rest?
So there's general consensus among people on all sides of the debate that exceptional access is easier, not easy, but easier to solve for data at rest. And there's a lot of technical reasons for this, but one is you're dealing with a single device, you're not dealing with multiple parties. I can't interfere with the communications protocol, abuse the communications protocol, the cryptographic protocol, to trick you into decrypting something you shouldn't, because you've got to have the physical device. There are designs that have been proposed that say there is no master database, we'll just have the data, have the device itself be capable of disclosing its secret key. It makes the provenance of a request to unlock it easier. If a government, call it some authoritarian government, I don't want to point fingers, comes to Google, Microsoft, Apple, and says, here is a communication from a pedophile in our country, please give us the key to decrypt it. You don't know if this is really a pedophile or really a U.S. government official's conversation. It was just a communication intercept. If you have the device, well, they've got the device. So it established more the provenance of the request. It's not something they picked up by eavesdropping here in Washington or New York or Silicon Valley. So there are a lot of different technical reasons why it's easier. And I would just say one other thing. There was a report that came out a month or two ago from the Carnegie Foundation on encryption, and this was trying to find common ground. It had people on all sides of the question.
Jim Baker and
Jim
his
Baker, though he is now switched, but
shifting
also
his-
Chris Inglis, former deputy director of the NSA. My friend and co-author Susan Landau has also been working on this issue for more than 20 years, and Ron Rivest, one of the foremost academic cryptographers on the other side. And this group agreed. Phone encryption, not even laptop, but phone encryption for a variety of technical and legal reasons was probably the easiest one to solve. Not easy, but easiest.
So if I could, I know you asked the technical question to Steve, but I just wanted to pick up on the point you started out with this shift in the arguments that are being made now from terrorism to child exploitation. And child exploitation is absolutely awful, awful crime, and I think this is one reason they've moved to it is because there's universal agreement that where terrorism can be political, who's a terrorist depends on what country you're from and so forth. But I want to, again, go back to Jim Baker and his article on addressing that shift. And if you bear with me a minute, I just want to quote from that article. He said, "Crimes against children are horrific. Encryption clearly affects the ability of law enforcement officials to investigate and apprehend criminals who engage in heinous crimes involving children. Recent reporting, however, indicates that the substantial increase in offenses against children over the years and the inability of law enforcement to effectively address the problem represents a complex, systemic failure with multiple causes and many responsible parties, not the least of which are the producers and consumers of such material. There is plenty of blame to go around for society's colossal collective failure to protect children. Encryption is only one of the challenges."
And, if I could just add, I think potentially one explanation that I think that the summit focused on data in transit versus data at rest. I think, as we've seen kind of even from San Bernardino, law enforcement eventually was able to get in the phone. And I think to our dismay, great dismay on the part of our security engineers, there are several companies that advertise the ability to access iPhones, and we know that law enforcement takes advantage of that technology. I think we do our best to try and lock down our systems as much as possible, but I think it is a reasonable argument that this has not metastasized into the kind of the systemic problem that I think at one time people thought might happen.
There's quite a variety of different issues here. The FBI did just take down a very large child pornography ring without breaking the encryption. Other high-tech tools and traditional police work. It's not, it makes life easier in some ways, but it doesn't solve all the problems. There are other ways to solve it that don't involve weakening one of our stronger defenses.
I think that Jeff just made an important point to hone in on a little bit. Because security is hard, there are security vulnerabilities in devices. You mentioned companies like Celebrate that advertise to law enforcement the ability to get into cell phones that would otherwise remain locked. Is that a better model for how law enforcement should be able to get in, is focusing on things like vulnerabilities that already exist in the product rather than introducing?
So, I think, number one, I think it is already happening, right? Law enforcement takes advantage of these vulnerabilities and these products that are available on the market. I think, a really good question around that is, what are the parameters of that type of activity? What are the resources that should be available? What are the restrictions on that type of activity? But it's happening, and so I think obviously that has been used in many cases to help law enforcement investigate crimes. I think it's certainly from our perspective the idea of trying to build in some type of exceptional access mechanism that we would have to protect, that would essentially be irrevocable across hundreds of millions or more devices, the costs of that, from our perspective, are quite great, and the risks are quite high.
I'm actually a co-author of a couple of papers on what's called lawful hacking, and unlike some of my colleagues, I think it's a very good idea because these bugs, these vulnerabilities do exist. I do think there needs to be more process about it, more public debate. There's never been a public debate about the legality, the ethics of it, and there needs to be. I could point to law review article from 1953, which set out basically what the wiretap law passed 15 years later contained in terms of restrictions of wiretaps. We've never had that public debate on lawful hacking, and we need to. But the fact that lawful hacking is more difficult and more expensive is in many ways a feature. There was a concurring opinion by Justice Sotomayor a few years ago where she noted that the two real checks on police misbehavior in terms of search and seizure were not the need for a warrant, but community reaction and the cost and the visibility, the cost of misbehaving, the resources it took. If there is an exceptional access mechanism, call it a golden key if you want, it can make it quite covert and it makes it quite cheap, taking away both of the checks that Justice Sotomayor identified as quite vital. I'm here in Washington. I can talk about the Church Committee hearings, which I'm old enough to remember, in 1976, about lots of misbehavior by the FBI, by the CIA, and so on. There's no reason to think that won't happen again.
Yeah, just one thing I want to add to your question about kind of are there other ways to address this issue. I mean, there was a good report that the Center for Strategic and International Studies did maybe about a year ago, and actually did a survey of law enforcement to try and find out kind of where is the tension that they face with digital evidence. And it was actually very interesting what they found. They found that really the largest challenges that law enforcement identified were actually figuring out what data exists, who to go to get it, how to get it, and then once they have it, kind of how to interpret it. And that those challenges, and this doesn't apply to, this is unencrypted data, and those challenges, I think, ranked higher substantially than getting access to a device that was encrypted. And it really, I think, this conversation would really benefit from the tech industry and law enforcement actually looking at kind of what are the goals here, and the goal should be let's assist law enforcement to better protect communities and do their jobs, but at the same time we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect the privacy and security of our users. And there is, I think, a really good conversation there to focus on helping them stop crimes, but not at the expense of our customers.
And if I could just build on both of these threads here, first on what we call government hacking. To Steve's point, there's absolutely a need for rules in this space. We recognize governments are doing this. It is happening, and so there's a real need to regulate the circumstances under which the government should be allowed to do it and the scope of what they can do. So when you have the Apple versus FBI case where they had the phone in their possession and they had probable cause, Fourth Amendment standards were met against this suspect, that predicate was maybe met there, but there also needs to be rules not only on the circumstances under which they can engage in hacking, but what is the scope of what they can access. They shouldn't be able to get the full scope of everything on your phone, for example. And so there was my organization, Open Technology Institute, we participated in a multi-stakeholder effort through the Transatlantic Cyber Forum, and a paper that came out about a year ago talking about what some of those rules should look like to regulate that government hacking. And then second, I want to agree with Jeff's point about the CSIS report on the low-hanging fruit, and that is the conversation to have about the kind of training that we can provide to enable law enforcement officers to access the digital evidence that is already legally and practically available to them, that they just don't know how they can go about getting it.
Yeah, it may sound a little surprising, but my colleague Susan Landau, who's a co-author with me on many of my papers on encryption and lawful hacking, has called in congressional hearings called publicly to give more resources to the FBI and to aid them in aiding local police departments in dealing with this digital evidence. There's no doubt that there are not enough resources, especially for local police departments, for dealing with this, and it's not just the crypto.
One of the things that gets brought up a lot by people who are involved in the cryptography debate is the difference between security versus privacy and security versus better security. The idea that while the debate that the Department of Justice is having is whether civil liberties whether the security that the Department of Justice can provide would be hindered by giving too much credence to civil liberties debates. What security experts argue is whether the security that the Department of Justice can provide is worth giving up the security that encryption provides. So I think just to address that point, if we took away the civil liberties problem, if you assume that there are no bad actors in any government agency, that everyone is, that everything is above board, that no one will ever use these devices, these tools in order to do anything that was objectionable in any way. Is encryption still important to protect?
If nobody in the entire planet is going to do anything, it's wrong. It's another matter. But I would add, quite apart from that cryptography is an amazingly powerful tool, not just for encrypting the data, protecting its privacy. It's necessary for integrity. It's necessary for authentication. When you log in, you can do it far more securely than you can with a password. There are amazing cryptographic tricks that can be done. You can do. People worry about cloud computing. What if the cloud provider is going to look at my data? You can do calculations on encrypted data where the person doing the calculation doesn't know what the data is, doesn't know what the question is, but you will get the right answer and you can verify it. It's not always practical, but the remarkable number of situations where it is very practical and is used today. Google released a library that uses cryptographic techniques for something called the geeky name of private set intersection. But what that really means is you can have a collection of data, someone else can have a collection of data, and without either of you disclosing the data, you can find out which data items match. Think of, I'll give you a hypothetical. You going out to a bar dating, and your phone is broadcasting encrypted things about what you're looking for, and someone else's phone is broadcasting what they're looking for and what they are, and if it matches up, the two of you can be introduced, but you don't have to say what it is you're looking for.
I can't, I need to push back against the premise that civil liberties are only because we think there's sometimes bad actors in government. We, among other things, privacy matters in all sorts of spheres. It matters in terms of just things that you do that you don't want other people to know about. And we also don't want the all-knowing government, even if they were never going to take harmful action against us. We don't want to live in that kind of surveillance state. So I want to push back against that. And then also with regard to the framing, there very much are, it's not, as you know, a privacy versus security debate that we're having here. There are security concerns very much on both sides. You might frame them differently. The particular law enforcement cases where they're trying to get access to a locked phone, maybe on the one side, but we have so many security issues for not only digital security, but we heard on the prior panel about the real physical security interests that are protected by encryption as well, from victims of domestic violence to LGBTQ people who it may be illegal in their country. There are so many security interests at stake on that side as well.
And let me just take your question and tie it to something that I think also the Attorney General brought up during the summit. And he, I think he was referencing a comment that the EFF had made, saying that that law enforcement wants. The getting into a device is kind of the equivalent of looking into your living room. And his comment was, well, actually, we can do that under the law, and we often get warrants that let us do that. And I think you have to frame it differently. So let's assume that law enforcement always has the best intentions and they don't do anything wrong, and let's assume that they're infallible and they don't make mistakes. What they're really asking for in this case is to basically that the designer of your living room, who also is meant to secure that living room from everybody else, and that living room holds all of your sensitive data, they want us to put a window in it, a window that only law enforcement can look through and no one else can. And I think that is really kind of what the equivalent is here. And that is what we're saying is just too dangerous and really can't be secured in that way. So even assuming that encryption protects from a variety of bad actors.
I think we have about 15 minutes left, and so I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes? Oh.
Sure. We don't want to repeat your question incorrectly.
Maybe they'll reach you.
All right. Excuse me. Hot mic. I've got a few things that I want to bring up, but the first one is that I think between the two panels is really interesting because this kind of question dates back to even the Alien and Sedition Acts. So it's been a question throughout American security history from our initial beginnings. And encryption now is, and who is able to decrypt and encrypt is clandestine, right? Like in the USSR in the Cold War era, even in the United States, you could hear static on the phone, you know somebody's listening to you, right? Or the letter's been torn open, when you receive it, you know somebody has accessed that information. What was brought up in the previous panel was the how can you communicate to individuals whether or not products, companies use this end-to-end encryption or use other methods? And so I'm curious. Are there ways that companies are working towards communicating that, like washing machine symbols, right? How, like, you're not going to read through the EULA to determine whether or not there's end-to-end encryption. Can there just be a symbol that says this signal has it, Twitter doesn't, or whatever?
Let's just pause for a second to
Yes.
give it. I guess does Apple have a mechanism that you like that you would notify customers about the strength and practice of encryption?
Sure, and so we actually have a privacy website that pretty details kind of what different services and products and we offer, how they're secured, what type of data we share. But I think does a pretty good job. Another thing that we do, and I really encourage people to look at it, is we post law enforcement guidance publicly. So I think this does two things. One, it helps law enforcement understand how to get in touch with us to request data, but it also provides the user with a transparent understanding of what data Apple has access to. And so I think that's something that we really encourage other companies to do. I think it really serves, I think, both interests.
If I understood correctly, you're asking, how do I know if somebody else is able to receive encrypted messages from me? In its general case, that's a really, really hard technical problem. I have 3 different apps on my phone, maybe 4, that can send end-to-end encrypted messages to someone, and I have to know which app that my desired communicant has and what it takes to actually set up this communication with them. So it's not an easy question, and how do I really know that I'm talking to the right person is another difficult question. Some of this comes down to not just research, but very hard research. There's also the usability piece of it. Will everyone understand what's going on? Yeah. I am an iPhone user, but when I send a text message on iPhone, I know after I've sent it if the message was sent end-to-end encrypted, because it shows up blue on my screen. If it shows up green, it meant it was sent as an ordinary text message, which is not encrypted. But I don't know that before I send the message. So I call that a security usability flaw on Apple's part. It's,
I mean,
you know
I think,
it.
well, I guess the follow-up to that would be, given the difficulties with security and the range of companies that need to be involved in security, do we want to trust companies with self-certifying themselves that way?
Preferably no, but someone's got to certify it. Again, who is going to certify? If I want to send you an encrypted message, how do I know it's really you? If we met in person and did the right things, I can have assurance. But when I want to go buy something from Amazon, how do I know it's really Amazon that I'm talking to? Again, there are solutions that often work. On the web, they work decently, but far from perfectly. And in other situations, it's a much harder problem.
Susan, you just smirked, so... No, okay. The smirk will go unexplained. Does that it sounded like you had a list of questions. Does anyone else have a question that we can get through just to make sure everyone has a chance? All right, sorry.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Again, the second development that I think is incredibly important is past 20 years globalization, right? Increasing communications between individuals due to the internet all across the world. But what we're seeing right now is also sequestering. We've blocked Huawei, we've blocked ZTE out of the United States. Other countries are adopting them. Huawei's top executives don't even use Huawei phones; they use Apple phones. So from a risk and security perspective, is it better to just block companies that we have risk concerns about out of U.S. markets, or is it better to do things like the EU is doing, like with GDPR, if I get the order of those letters correctly, where they're trying to regulate and assess companies that have substantial risk, and while allowing them into the market?
I'm not shy, I'll start. There's not going to be one answer. One of the principles of cryptographic design is that you don't trust the network. It could be because it's got Huawei components. It could be because you don't trust the phone company. It could be because you don't trust the government that controls the phone company. It could be because you think that someone has hacked into the network. Or just put a pair of wire clips on the phone line. You don't trust the network. That's a principle of cryptographic design. You're in much worse shape when it comes to trusting your phone or computer supplier and the operating system supplier. How to deal with that is a very difficult research question, and so-called supply chain attacks, where the vendor you're dealing with is honest and thorough, but they're buying parts from other countries, and who knows how that's been sabotaged. These are real attacks. These really happen, and they're very difficult to defend against. There are also cryptographers working on a way to do computations where you don't have to trust far less, but some of that comes in the heading of research. It's a very difficult problem.
The risks presented by Huawei and other companies where we're concerned about the Chinese government having access and so forth is actually one of the cybersecurity reasons why it is so important to have strong encryption in the first place. But the answer to your question, in my view, is both. We want to address those risks coming from Huawei and other companies where we really have reason to not trust them, and also we want to have strong consumer privacy legislation here in the United States to limit the extent to which companies that are subject to United States jurisdiction have the ability to collect massive amounts of data and what they can do with it and how they have to treat it and safeguard it. So we want to do both.
Just to echo those points, we treat any network as an untrusted network, and I think that has to be the model going forward. And encryption, in particular with the move to 5G, is going to play a critical role in ensuring at least the confidentiality and integrity of data that moves back and forth. But I think you raise a concern that lawmakers have, and that's a kind of a larger concern than ours. But the availability of data is another issue. But so I think to your question, and I really echo what Stephen said, is that it's going to be a mixture, but the default has to be that any network can't be trusted.
You might want to keep Huawei gear out of your core network, because what if Huawei decides to turn it off? Encryption's not going to help you there. You just can't talk. And there's also a more subtle threat, which the military calls traffic analysis, who's talking to whom. This is a very valuable law enforcement and intelligence technique. The intelligence agencies have been using it for more than 100 years. It started during World War I. It's extremely hard to hide from a traffic analyst. Not impossible. There are techniques on the internet to do that, but it's a lot harder and doesn't scale nearly as well to the kind of internet that we can watch movies on.
So I'm Joe. I work at the Internet Society. Steve, you had said it's. Let me get it right. You can't steal something that doesn't exist, or something that doesn't exist cannot be stolen. And I've heard echoes of that recently in people talking about zero trust networks or zero trust systems. And I know, for example, Apple many years ago moved to a system to where now there is an entanglement of a key with the PIN, so that you need more than just something on the device and something that Apple doesn't have any access to get that. I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about that, and then maybe places where that is too hard of a model. So, for example, I know one of the things that frustrates a lot of encrypted systems is account recovery. This notion that if I drop my phone in the ocean, it may be so strong that I'm never going to see my pictures ever again, and that we have sort of other things that on the human side sort of make it harder to do things that would be sort of extremely hard security.
I don't have anything to say. You outlined it. Exceptional error recovery is a difficult problem. Lost password recovery is a difficult problem, especially when the password's used to protect encryption. Sometimes the trade-off is between, do I want to risk losing the data forever if I lose my key, or do I want to have more copies of the key more easily available, but risk somebody else getting a copy of it? My crucial passwords are written down in an envelope a sealed envelope that my wife has, because among other things, there are tens of thousands of pictures. That's a risk I'm willing to take because I trust my wife. On the other hand, I'm not in a domestic violence situation where that might be a problem. It's often a trade-off. We don't have great answers to this. Yeah, we have partial answers. There are techniques where you can say, I'm going to give 5 different people a piece of the key, and any 3 of them can reconstitute the original key, but no 2 can. And to be really sure, I'm going to go give it to 5 people in 5 different legal jurisdictions to avoid court orders and so on. This is done for some high-level authentication keys on the internet today. This exact technique. A variety of techniques, nothing fully general. A lot depends on your threat model. Who do you think is after your data? What will they do? I'm not worried about someone who really wants my pictures of birds breaking into my apartment. It's not going to happen.
I think that actually brings up an important question. From a free market sense, if you were able to create a successful golden key system, would you be able to sell password recovery? I mean, would that actually be a system would there have been an economic incentive to invent this if it was inventable?
So the U.S. government tried that in the 90s with the Clipper chip. The Clipper chip was a hardware device invented by the NSA, probably at the behest of the FBI, that would provide exceptional access to encrypted communications. And they tried selling this to companies for encrypted data recovery. The problem was that in the 1990s, there was essentially no encrypted data at rest. It was too expensive. You couldn't do it. We didn't have mobile phones. We barely had laptops. You couldn't afford to encrypt the laptop because it would slow down the disk too much and so on. And for encrypted communications, corporations, if you lose the key to a conversation, just hang up and dial again. So it did not get any place then. Beyond that, go back to what I said about encryption being a system. If I'm a corporation, I'm dealing with employees, the corporate office of corporate security are the ones who've got the right to do the unlock. They don't have to go worry about, is this a real police officer with a real warrant from a country with a functioning, rights-respecting legal system? It's a very, if I forget my password, maybe my boss has it in her desk. Doesn't have to authenticate me. She recognizes me by sight. So it's a very, very different problem, and I don't think the two are comparable.
I think we might have time for one more question. Does anyone have? No one? Okay. I think I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for being here and for everyone involved with setting this up, for letting us do this.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Ooh, thank you all for being here. Feel free to grab food, take a second lunch, dinner. There's also muffins over there. They're a little bit hidden, but thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.